For more on a post-INF Treaty world, and more importantly, what's happening with the transatlantic relations, with us in Brussels, we have Jamie Shea, who is a senior fellow with Friends of Europe. He's also former Deputy Assistant Secretary General of Emerging Security Challenges at the NATO headquarters in Brussels. In Berlin, we have Hans Moll, Senior Distinguished Fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin. In Boston, the U.S., Jim Walsh, Senior Research Associate at MIT's Security Studies Program. And in Beijing, China, we have Teng Jianchun, Director for the Center of Arms Control at the China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, I want to welcome the four of you. Certainly, we have a very strong panel for a very important topic. First of all, may I go to Mr. Walsh? We see this year is a big year for transatlantic relations. 70th anniversary of NATO. Also, 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. A lot of things are happening, but many really wonder, what is now the nature of relations for the cross-Atlantic countries?
Well, I think they're poor. Now, I've been to security conferences like the Munich conference, where all the NATO folks get together and say, NATO's never been stronger. We have a new communique that has really strong language. We have these exercises that are really big. But that ignores the fact that what underpins the relationship is the relations between President Trump and the European leaders, between the United States and Europe. And those relations are poor. The President repeatedly speaks in public in disdainful ways about NATO, criticizes NATO, criticizes individual leaders, seems to show no interest in the alliance, and in this case, as he has elsewhere, has acted unilaterally, whether that's the Paris Peace Accord or the Iran nuclear deal, or now the INF. Now, I think Russia is violating the INF, but there are different ways to handle this, and certainly one way to handle it is to consult with your European allies before you go off and make a big announcement. So I think there are some problems here.
Well, you said with one adjective, poor. Mr. Shea, is that also the adjective you would like to choose?
No, frankly, I wouldn't, and I've been a direct participant in hundreds of NATO meetings between Europeans, Canadians and Americans over the last few years, so I've really seen the transatlantic relationship in action. And indeed, you've just had, you mentioned it in your opening section, the Vice President Pence, the Secretary of State Pompeo visiting an important NATO ally in Poland just yesterday, and making it clear in multiple statements that the United States is fully committed to NATO, to the defense of NATO territory, vis-à-vis a possible challenge from Russia. And yes, there are some statements from time to time. They mainly concern, however, not the loyalty to NATO, which I think is very clear. In fact, in the last couple of days in the United States, we've had several moves in the US Congress, both in the Senate and the House of Representatives, which have overwhelmingly, Republicans and Democrats, and I mean overwhelmingly, emphasized the United States commitment to NATO. The problem is more, which is a classic NATO problem, which is burden sharing, which is the United States spends a good deal of the budget and the Europeans don't spend enough. But if you just allow me one final comment in this opening round, you do see that the Europeans realize now that they need to rebalance NATO, and they have added over $40 billion to collective NATO budgets over the last 3 years. And at the end of next year, that will be $100 billion extra dollars. So I think the thing that President Trump is really focused on, which is not so much NATO, but the burden sharing issue, is now being addressed by the European allies. And the United States is putting more and more dollars and more troops into the defense of Europe. So I don't
Mr. Moll, I need to have another speaker come in rather than a dominating voice in this discussion. I'm sorry, Mr. Shea. Mr. Moll,
excuse me.
Yes.
Mr. Moll, please help us to understand from your perspective. I mean, earlier Mr. Shea talked about the Secretary of State visiting Europe to the European nations, try to reassure the NATO members, but obviously you heard also different voices coming from Washington suggesting, let's just take care of the new Europe rather than the old Europe, because obviously the old Europe, quote unquote, are having a different thought. What do you think? Is it?
Well, you know, my answer to your initial question would be NATO is both strong and in problems. So I'm sort of somewhat in between.
You're sitting on the fence.
Very strong in the sense of the
Sure.
underlying ties.
Go ahead.
No, I'm sitting not on the fence, but in between.
Okay, there we
This is
go.
not necessarily on the fence, though it can be on the fence. No, but seriously speaking, I mean, I think the underlying ties which bind together the two halves of the Atlantic world, transatlantic relations, are, you know, continue to be very strong. And we should not forget that Donald Trump is not the representative of America alone. I mean, there's more to the United States policies than Donald Trump alone. But if you take the executive branch, in particular the president, cooperation within NATO has been very complicated and has been significantly disturbed. And frankly, I also don't agree that this is just a normal crisis for NATO. This is a situation of a kind which we haven't had before, and a crisis which we haven't had before. And the epicenter of that crisis, it seems to me, is in the White House in Washington.
Interesting argument there. So you got so many different views already illustrated in our wonderful panel. So, Mr. Tang, obviously, you're only observing from afar, but China also plays a big role in international issues these days. So, as a Chinese scholar, how are you observing the evolving situation, let's just say, about transatlantic relations?
First, we should say we have already entered a new era. That is to say,
which means what?
A new era of major powers strategic competition. This is not an era of fighting against terrorism, as you know we have witnessed in the recent years.
So you are saying even between the European countries and the United States,
so
it's a
the
strategic
United
competition?
States, China, and Russia now have already become the competitor and the strategic competitor. And under such circumstances, I'm sure each country would like to prepare in a large, region or long, region to see their security, to see the cooperation. And if you look at the recent, large-scale military drills by Russia in the last year, and also by NATO members last year, you can see these war games actually were under the background of comprehensive or large war with the use of nuclear weapons. And so this is a new era we have already entered into.
So you are saying there could be possibility also of arms race, because we are looking at, I don't want to feed words into your mouth, but if you are looking at the apparent decision to withdraw from INF, first of all, from the United States, and then Russia reportedly said that it is in reaction to the U.S. withdrawal. So are you suggesting there's, as a result of strategic competition, certainly likely to be an arms race? Is that what you're saying?
No, I don't think there should be a real arms race among major powers, but the competition is not only in military, not only in weapon system, but in some other areas. For example, the economic competition, the geopolitical competition, which require any country from each side to give their consent to these issues.
Mr. Shea, you see the U.S. and also NATO, for example, and countries in Europe, which of course they are covering different areas, not only on the issue of what's likely to be the funding for NATO, but also on issues like trade. That's, even though a smaller scale, but certainly that's already something souring the relationship, as some say. Meanwhile, you also have this difference, as we mentioned earlier, between the so-called New Europe and the Old Europe, which the U.S. feels differently about. So, and also feels differently when it comes to the complication of building alliances with. So, Mr. Shea, how complicated to you is the picture?
Well, I certainly think it's more complicated than sometimes we see from headlines. For example, I don't personally believe that the United States is less committed to old Europe and is now only favouring new Europe. For example, the United States now sends Marines regularly to Norway, which is certainly part of Western Europe. It has a very strong defence relationship with my own country, the United Kingdom. France and the United States cooperate very closely in counter-terrorism operations operations in Syria and in the Sahel in Mali. And indeed, the United States is investing now heavily, not just in putting rotational forces in Poland or in Eastern Europe, but in recreating across the Atlantic into Western Europe the American Second Fleet and now new sea lines of communication. So I don't think the United States, when it looks at NATO, sort of differentiates between good guys and bad guys. I think it recognizes that the unity of the whole is absolutely core to NATO's credibility.
The ever-increasing possibility of U.S. military presence, more of it, inside Europe is certainly an issue rising up recently, particularly with Pompeo's visit to the Central European countries. Mr. Walsh, I also want to invite you your insight on this. There are a lot of talks about increasing of missiles being stationed inside Europe coming from the U.S. Talks about, despite of the differences, but the U.S. increase its military presence through NATO. What do you think about this mixed discussion? There are messages coming from here, this side. There are also messages coming from exactly the opposite side. Are we in a confusion? Is the U.S. in a very clear vision, sir, about what to do with the European counterparts? Sorry for a loaded question, but I think these are important aspects of the same question.
Well, again, I think there are some real issues here. The media reporting strongly suggests that the president has questioned whether the U.S. should be in NATO, and has not done so not once, not twice, but several times in White House discussions. We've never had a president who did that before. Now, as we talk about Europe, I don't expect, I think it's terrible that INF seems to be slipping away. I think there's a whole architecture here that has helped provide stability and peace for decades. But I do not expect that if INF were to go away, that Russia would immediately embark on a missile race. It really can't afford another arms race. That's really not in its self-interest. So I don't expect that, and I don't know that the Europeans are going to be really, or at least the European public, is going to be very excited about having new missiles based in Europe, because those, of course, become targets for Russia. And if you go back to the origins here, how did we get here? It was Ronald Reagan. It was the mid-1980s. There were protests across Europe involving hundreds of thousands of people, the birth of the Freeze movement. This was all over the issue of putting new missiles in Europe. And so we'll have to take the temperature, but I doubt many Europeans are very excited about that prospect. Well, but I don't expect it to sort of just zoom up to missile racing. It's bad, though. I think we tear down these pillars, these regimes, whether it's New START or INF or other international agreements, we tear them down at our peril. We don't appreciate how important they are until they're gone, and then it's too late. So I hope we all find a way back here. Russia has definitely violated the INF, but there are more ways to solve this than simply picking up our toys and going home.
Right. The relations with Russia is another complicated issue. We would rather exclude that issue in our discussion today because we cannot contain so many things in the same debate. But Mr. Ma, let me go to you about the complications here as well. According to Mr. Gorbachev, of course, who has been a big name if you look at the past history 30 years ago, he talked about the INF Treaty, once being scrapped off, it's marking the start of all the achievements being reached throughout the Cold War and also at the end of the Cold War in order to guarantee security in the region, whether between the former Soviet Union and the West or in Europe and also the United States. So, Mr. Ma, as someone from Germany, there seems to be a very careful choice that countries like yours have to make now when you face strategic issues and possibilities like this.
Yes, indeed. This is not an easy situation for German diplomacy, and this is fully recognized. And I have sympathy for the assessment by Mikhail Gorbachev when he says that those achievements, if I understand him rightly, achievements made during the Cold War in terms of arms control and limitations of arms racing, And at the end of the Cold War, in terms of building bilateral treaties which allowed disarmament to some extent, that both these achievements now are under risk. I think this is the case, this is so, and as Jim just indicated, I would agree with that view. We are not just talking about the INF Treaty.
No.
We are talking about a pillar of arms control agreements whose destruction will endanger other pillars of arms control, such as the New START agreement, which is now greatly uncertain, it seems to me. It's going to run out in 2021, and it seems unlikely that something will follow. And also, I think we have to think of the nuclear non-proliferation regime here. Again, that seems to be something which is now looking pretty shaky. So it's not only about the INF. And one of the paradoxes, of course, is anyway that a lot of people are scratching their heads and trying to find out what Russia exactly has in mind with those cruise missiles, because it has so many other weapon systems which can threaten Europe, not least, you know, air-based or sea-based cruise missiles. So why have they decided to develop this system and do it in a way which clearly breaches the INF Treaty?
Right.
It's a puzzle, but the puzzle is part of a much larger picture. You know, we talked before about an arms race. I think we are, I don't know whether you call it an arms race, but an arms build-up has been going on for quite some time.
Mr. Tong, the three other speakers,
you know, we are confronting a situation where technological advances in armaments.
Yeah. The three earlier speakers have beautifully illustrated the complex situation that they each individually face and also collectively for this transatlantic relationship face. Now, you explained earlier, this is a time when many factors are fluid. They're also moving toward against, you know, in different factions toward one another. So, Mr. Tong, how do you understand some of the options that the transatlantic relationship is facing right now as a Chinese security scholar?
There are a lot of uncertainties.
Give me some of the points that you are looking at.
For example, the relations between the United States and France and Germany. You know, today the Middle East conference are being held in Poland, and the foreign ministers from these two countries, you know, didn't appear there. And the British foreign minister just attended the opening ceremony yesterday. So this is
you also see the argument through the Hungary foreign minister and also Mr. Pompeo, which is very different from Polish tone toward Mr. Pompeo. So a lot of differences, different voices.
So the withdrawal of INF Treaty by the United States will give a very negative you know, impact on the relations across an Atlantic Ocean, because the United States might say this is a good choice for the United States, but this is a bad choice for the European countries. And as a result, I think such a treaty actually is, you know, from the, you know, effort made not only by the former Soviet Union and then the United States, it's also an effort by the European countries. And, you know, at that time, the Chancellor of Western Germany gave a great contribution to such agreement or treaty between the two superpowers in the Cold War time.
As complicated as it is, Mr. Shea, that's why they try to figure it out through the upcoming Munich Security Conference. One of the biggest topics is transatlantic relations. But there are two possibilities, shall I say, sir. One is that, well, maybe different sides express their views and they try to come to consensus and they manage to a certain extent. But there could also be the possibility different sides express their opinions and they are going directly against one another or in very different divergent ways. Sir, when you see that intellectual debate, shall I say, academic and security debate, what's likely to be the tone from your perspective?
Well, I think there's a lot of frank talking across the Atlantic, and that's no bad thing. You've got to remember, NATO is an alliance of democracies, 29, nearly 30 democracies, and it's the habit of democracies that they have their own views and that they have to debate and achieve consensus. But the one thing about NATO, and I was there for nearly 39 years, so I witnessed this over many generations, is that even after the most difficult debates, NATO always agrees in the end and finds consensus, because because I generally believe that we're held together by common democratic values, and the things that unite us, all of those threats that we've been talking about today and challenges, always are greater than the factors that divide us. So I don't necessarily see that frank talking as a sign of weakness. As a NATO historian, the first book I read about the crisis in NATO was, believe it or not, was published in 1962. So yes, we have had lots of debates over the years. That's key. And as I said, one of the key ones at the moment is this burden sharing debate, which requires the Europeans to spend more and to spend better. But you know, again, you know, if you look at an iceberg, the most significant part is the 3/4 that is under the ocean. It's the part you don't see, and sometimes you only focus on that little tip of the iceberg above the water. My sense is that we will come out of it united.
1962. That's the first book when we see Mr. Shea, the one that was published 1962 about crisis in NATO. But of course,
predicting NATO's imminent demise. Yes.
Yes, it's very different. One could argue 1962,
my death are greatly exaggerated,
which is 20 years, almost 20 years after the Second World War, and today, when the world is changing in such a dramatic way. Before we go, Mr. Mao, I also want to have another European voice to wrap it up. Your thought here.
About the future of the transatlantic relationship?
About the Munich Security Council and
I think
that
first
topic,
of all,
briefly.
I would not make this simple. On the future of the transatlantic relationship. That's the question here, right?
Yes.
Yes. I think we will not see much agreement between the Europeans and among the Europeans themselves, indeed, and the United States coming out of Munich. This is an occasion for people to just exchange views, frankly, and cooperation is going to be very difficult. But let me also point out that the division of Europe into an old Europe and a new Europe is really misleading. It's more complicated than that, and you have sort of coalitions on different issues all the time.
That's right.
Some countries are very hawkish on Russia. Others are very positively disposed towards Russia, and those include old and new European member countries. So that distinction is not terribly helpful. Overall, I think what you're going to see in the longer run and beyond the Munich Security Conference is that the increasing pressure coming from Russia on NATO and on the European Union is going to produce more unity and more cooperation.
Well, we'll see what's going to happen, whether predictions are really the realities for the future. Thank you so much, the four of you, for joining us. Jamie Shea, Hans Mo, Jim Walsh, last but not least, Teng Jianxun. Really appreciate it, gentlemen, for being with us. Thank you.